Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Table Talk. Today, we are going to discuss an essay by Aníbal Arregui called Reversible Pigs, an Infraspecies Ethnography of Wild Boars in Barcelona. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan. My co-host Anu is also here. We meet occasionally to discuss articles we like, which discuss human-animal relations across the world. The discussion is going to be for 1 hour. And as more people join, we will tell them that they can ask questions at any time. I thought we could begin the conversation by talking about the interesting title and reversible pigs. Could you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for the invite. As I was telling you before, I'm very excited to connect from so far away, right? Barcelona to India. It's amazing. And as I was saying, I was inspired by some Indian scholars or people working in India. And I know, I've been in India and I have observed, but I know you have a very special way of dealing with animals in the city, especially. So I'm very excited to share this research with you. And yeah, so the title. Okay, what the first idea of the title is was the main concept of the article, which is this idea of reversibility, and it refers to the idea that wild boars cannot be fixed in biological categories, for instance, being wild, or when referring to their habitat of being rural animals, right? There are so many instances in which you see these animals shifting behavior, shifting habitats, and affects, and many things that put them in relation to humans that made me think, okay, we're speaking here about some kind of reversibility, and the idea of reversibility, it is not disclosed in the paper, but actually, in my mind at least, it intends to be an alternative to hybridity. Hybridity is a common term to refer to many modern or postmodern situations where usual categories don't work. But I was finding that actually for capturing what my interlocutors in the field meant and the kind of concepts they used, hybridity was not working exactly, because they were still using like wild, domestic, urban, rural, these kinds of dichotomies, right? So it is a sort of conceptualization by the anthropologist, but at the same time a way of using this a concept which is more emic, more attached to the way people use their language. And that's about the title. Then there is the subtitle, which opens this second line of reflection, which is more general on infraspecies, but we might discuss this later if you want.
But about reversibility, is the wild boar reversible for the same person in different ways, or is the hunter does the hunter see the wild boar in a particular way, but somebody else who's living in an urban space, they see the wild boar in a different way? Or does the reversibility apply to the same person as well?
Yeah, great question, and this is actually a key question. And as I say it, so wild boars, well, what I observe is that they can be reversible for the same person. So I've been like in conversation with many people in these suburban neighborhoods of Barcelona who actually they say this pig in particular is tame, but it can be wild in any moment. So this is always a sort of premise to say, okay, they might be tame, but if you do the wrong gesture, they might be wild. They might become hostile suddenly, and this is why this tame or even this domesticity, wildness, can be seen as potentials that are inherent in every singular wild boar. This is one of the reasons why I use reversibility, and the other reason is more like ecological, because what I see is that they also introduce sort of reversibility quality in the very ecological context. But again, this is a question that we can discuss maybe later.
You go ahead, and people who are attending, please feel free to ask a question or jump in with a comment at any point in the discussion.
Yeah, so I had a question again about reversibility, and then another follow-up question based on what Susan just said about individual responses. So my first question would be, how is reversibility different from liminality? Given that, reversibility is also, I mean, there are these potentials, and a particular wild boar could shift from one to the other. And liminality is also this in-between kind of status where it could go this way or that. It could be not yet this, but already that, or that was in the past, something on those lines. So I'm wondering if there is a marked difference between your use of the term reversibility from the way one would tend to use liminality. And my second question, which was a follow-up to what Susan was just saying, was also in thinking about this relational uncertainty, where responses focus on individual animals rather than on a species. Does this apply to human animals as well? When you speak of individuals, is this individual boars, or is this also individual human animals? Because I imagine that despite the statistics, responses from one person to the other must vary a lot based on who those people are as individuals.
Yeah, thank you, Anu. Yeah, great questions too. In fact, one of the scholars that inspired my work is Radhika Govindrajan, who did this now famous book already, Animal Intimacies. And she, for instance, uses the idea of liminality to describe the case of a wild boar who escapes, and then it causes some confusion. And it is, in her words, a liminal being that it's always navigating between the wild and the domestic. And of course, and this is totally connected. Actually, I quote that part of Animal Intimacies book because it connects directly with reversibility. The difference is, in my view, is that liminality puts the emphasis on precisely the line of connection, the line of separation, or this border where things change to another state. And reversibility puts more the emphasis on the, let's say, stabilization of a status, even if it is a temporal stabilization. And as I was saying before, for me, this works better in order to capture what my interlocutors say and explain to me, and the way they address relations. I think liminality, in the same way as hybridity, are very academic terms. You could say also reversibility is very academic. People don't say pigs are reversible. It's not an emic concept in that sense. It's just the logic that it's more emic, in the sense that what I try to capture is the fact that they still define wild boars as being wild, and in some instances as being tame. They define them as being rural, but in some instances as being urban. And yeah, it's just a way of putting the emphasis on the result when you, at some point, I think you have to take a decision. Okay, how do I relate to this subject, right? Should I be cautious and afraid, or should I, kind of explore more familiarity? And I think that people take in their quotidian lives these relational choices, and they do it in a very flexible way. That, if one takes the decision, okay, with this particular wild boar, I will get close to it. I might feed it, I might pet it, or something like that. But maybe with another one, not, or the same wild boar, depending on the mood which is showing that day, you might opt for, okay, I'm keeping the distance today. So reversibility, by contrast to liminality or hybridity, is a way of putting the emphasis on the moment where you have taken a relational choice and you are kind of orienting your daily acts accordingly. And your other comment on uncertainty, which is also, of course, very interesting, because one of the things is I work a lot with natural scientists, mainly biologists and veterinarians, who are the ones actually in charge of taking care and controlling wild boar populations. And one of the things that I try to make them understand, because they sometimes you have this view that people actually relate to wild boars because they don't know the species, or because they don't have a knowledge about ecology and so on. But what I say is rather actually people are exposed to wild boars, and wild boars actually are exposed to to people, despite the efforts by local authorities to manage this situation, right? They try everything. I can go through the measures, the specific measures later if you want. But the main point is that despite all the measures to control wild boar presence in the city, they are still coming more and more, and people are exposed. So what I say is that dealing with reversibility is a way of dealing with uncertainty. People actually have accepted the fact that they go out of their homes and they can find wild boars, and they need to cope with this new. Of course, urban life has always had many uncertainties, but this is something rather new, or at least dating from the last decades in Spain. And yeah, and you were mentioning, like, if this applies to other non-human or human animals, so to speak. And of course, yeah, that's the same thing. So when you go around in your neighborhood, you have very, very different kinds of relations with your neighbors. You don't like everyone, and not everyone likes you. And we tend to think that with other, the other species might be different. They are more homogeneous. But what you observe when you do ethnography and you get close to these people and these wild boars, you start to notice so many differences, variabilities, singularities that are very similar to what happens with human neighbors. And yeah, in this sense, you see a constellation of relations that is analogous to the constellation of relations that you have with humans in a neighborhood where people know each other. So, and uncertainty, of course, plays a role, because you never know what wild boar you will find, what mood will have this day in particular. And for me, the interesting thing is to show to other scientists, mainly natural scientists, that people actually are not silly or ignorant, but actually they are virtuos from virtuosity, in the sense that they are inventing ways of dealing with this mutual exposure and this everyday uncertainty that science and institutional measures can't erase completely.
I was curious about something you didn't really address in the essay. Maybe you didn't want to go there, but some people seem to be able to really see the boars, notice their idiosyncrasies, whereas some people, especially if they are from certain professions or from certain backgrounds, they have made up their minds about wild boars. So do you think it depends also on what kind of person you are, and whether you have some sort of affinity with animals at large, or wild boars specifically, to be able to see them as more than wild, or to see them as reversible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that people have different, let's say, psychological sensibilities, and this is besides scientific categories. There's people, as I was a child, there were kids who liked to, kill flies or ants. And for instance, I was not like, I didn't like it. And this was something that I can't even say if this was some family education. I think that's something that has to do with your innate sensibility. And this probably plays a role. And the other thing has to do with education, with culture, at many levels. And for instance, people who go through veterinary training or biological training, they are very close to the animals, but they also start to think about them through classic biological categories. And I think that in a sense, these animals at some point they become objectified. I mean, they are objects of inquiry. While for someone who has not this mindset so established from a scientific training, it might be easier to see the subject in the first place, okay? Because you have not all these categories coming, in this pack when you see a particular animal. So, in a sense, I think that yes, different people with different professional backgrounds and different sensibilities can approach animals in general, because this is not only something that happens with wild boars. This happens with animals in general, as you might also have observed in your own research. And I think that here, for me, the most basic way of explaining this is when you take as the first impression the objective qualities of a specimen, of an individual, or you go to perceive some more subjective qualities, when you actually are open to perceive some sort of subjectivity, even if it is different, And here is also maybe an important conceptual point that many people ask me if I'm kind of going for a sort of animist way of dealing with animals. But it is not exactly, because to start with, we are in a context where we could say that our education, at least, is in a naturalist way of thinking. I mean, we study Darwin and evolution and Linnaeus and the taxonomy, and so we study naturalism, not animism. But this means we might not be perceiving wild boars as humans, but we still might see some subjectivity in them. And for me, this is a way of thinking about these human, non-human relations from a dimension that is more general than the one proposed by many animist theories, which are claiming some sort of human subjectivity in other animals. I'm not claiming a human subjectivity. I'm saying some people, because of their sensibility or their training or their particular cultural context, they are very open to perceive subjectivity in non-human species beyond beyond humans. So I'm not sure if this answers more or less your question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But if you're not saying that, if you're not taking an animist point of view, but you are saying that some humans perceive a certain subjectivity in the wild boars, then what kind of subjectivity is it? In the essay, you describe it as some wild boars having idiosyncrasies, certain habits, habituation, and connections to certain places. Would that count as subjectivity? Is it what the wild boar does repeatedly that counts as subjectivity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this question is something that not only me, but also within, I work in collaboration with a group of scholars from Europe, Australia, many places, and we just chat about pigs in many circumstances. And very often comes this question about the subjectivity and how to take the pig perspective and so on. I'm also in touch with a scholar who works in Haifa, where also wild boars are very abundant and present in the city, and she does some ethological work on to explore what could be the subjective perspective of the animal. In my case, I because of my training as an anthropologist and my ignorance as an ethologist and my lack of tools to explore in an appropriate way what could be seen as a subjective point of view of wild boars, I limit this claim to observations of wild boars being different from one another, of considering them, you can say individuals, but sometimes when you say individuals, it's kind of, you open a scale of analysis that people tend to think, okay, this is an individualist kind of thinking, and you have to contemplate the collective dimension and so on. And of course, what I'm interested in the end is the collective dimension, which is actually ecology. It's not, there is nothing more collective than ecology. But for me, saying that wild boars are subjects is just a way of recognizing their singularities and their internal variability. And this goes to connect with the other part of the title, the subtitle, which is this idea of infraspecies ethnography, is a way of reducing the scale of analysis to a point where you start to see individual differences in animals that, even though they're individual, there are some tendencies. That doesn't mean that every wild boar, it's an individual and you cannot, make any kind of generalization. You have some tendencies, but these tendencies still are being used in a scale that is smaller than the one offered by the of species. So I still don't have any good example of how to prove wild boars are subjects. The only thing I can see is they are very different from one another. So they seem to be taking, personal decisions. They seem to have people. This is not me speaking; is one of my interlocutors, or actually more than one. They seem to have their own personality and their own way of dealing with people, right? So yeah, I think this is something we have. Western culture has lost a lot. This ability to perceive subjectivity in other species, and I think that seeing how this happens not only in context where animism is dominant, or a way of thinking about nature, seeing this in a context as Spain or Barcelona, where it's not animist as by tradition, it is also very interesting to see how humans still have this capacity to establish relations beyond naturalist schemes that tend to objectify other animals.
I see that Professor Rukmini has raised her hand. I'm gonna unmute her so she can ask or comment.
Susan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I always begin with a disclaimer when I attend Susan and Anu's table talks, which is to do with the fact that I'm not a person who studies animals. I study the human animal, and I'm a linguist. So I wanted to ask you about, you, to an extent, attribute, or humans attribute to the wild boars who are a force in their environment, they attribute a sort of personality or personhood, even if the wild boar has personhood or not. I wanted to ask you whether in this attribute of seeing individual differences among the wild boars, you also attribute intention to them, and whether you attribute I'm working on a book on deception at the moment, whether you can attribute to them the capacity to deceive. So that's one line of questioning, because deception, conversational reversibility, these are part of human understanding of other human animals. I wondered how you saw it in the interaction of different species in the field. The other question I wanted to ask you is about the theoretical term, which I find people using these days, which is more than human. And the more than you know, Descola and others use it. And I wanted to understand your relationship when you talk about reversibility to this notion of the more than human, and what your interpretation of it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the intentionality, I think it's easy to see in many animals, mainly in animals who are free, at least relatively free, right? It's not the same being in a farm and dealing with pigs or with cows who are closed and whose behavior is very, very limited, and they have not really many choices in their everyday. It's very different to analyze this in wild animals. These wild boars, of course, there is people who will claim this. They are not exactly wild because they live in an urban environment, let's say a domesticated landscape. They might be even dependent on humans at some, to some extent, because they feed on trash or on even on humans who feed them like by hand. But still, it is pretty, easy to see intentionality. So, for instance, if you are walking around and you have a rucksack or a bag or something, they actually make you know, they want to know what's inside, right? They use their snouts, they look at you. They can be even a bit pushy with that. There have been some problems, of course. There have been some incidents, but in many instances, they just let you know. It's like, for instance, when you have dogs like pets or cats, they have their ways of corporeally showing and communicating intention, a sort of will. What is more interesting, it's your second part of the question, and I cannot answer, is whether they have the ability to deceive, right? I still don't know. I still don't know if they can manage to somehow show an intention and then like display another one, right? That would be a deception. I still don't have any observation that makes me think, okay, they have managed to do that. But it's an interesting question to explore, and it has to do with cognitive, capabilities of animals, which are, I think that even ethological science is discovering more and more that animals can do much more than we thought they can. So it might be it might come the moment where we actually can prove, okay, wild boars can also deceive, but I have not had the chance to observe this. And your third question was on the more than human. Yeah, that's it's difficult for me because as a Spanish speaker, it does sound very bad in Spanish if we translate it. even if we, I don't know how is it in, I don't know, Indian or whatever, but it doesn't sound. And the other option is to say other than human, but this sounds even worse in Spanish. So I have a big problem with that. And in Spanish, we tend to say non-human, which is, some people say, okay, it's like negating a quality in another animal, which is true, but it's the only thing that sounds like legitimate in with Spanish grammar in mind.
So are you arguing that the linguistic frames that you have in your head determine how you're going to approach a theoretical question, like whether there is a subliminal world or everybody is connected, because you can't see your way through the frames of language as clearly, because that to me is an interesting observation, if true.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so, that your language background determines in some sense your theorization, and yeah, and probably my Spanish mind has made has generated these concepts in order to deal with this hegemony of the English scholarship, right? Even if I've written this paper and many others in English, still I think that my mind is a Spanish mind. So I need to find some concepts which fit it with my way of thinking and with the way my interlocutors use concepts and words in their everyday. But with the more than human or the other than human, one of the problems I have, and I don't think this is related to language, this is related to more ecological, wide-ranging ecological issues, is that I don't see any instance of nature which is non-human in a sense. If we are living in an age that we call or the Anthropocene or whatever, some equivalent category we use for that, and it might sound anthropocentric, but unfortunately, everything that we deal with is human in a sense. Even if it is not human, is not part of our species. For instance, I don't see the world of wild boars as a more than human world. I think, of course, they have different capacities and qualities, but their situation now, it's very constrained by human intentions and by human disturbances on the environment. So yeah, I may use more than human, but just to understand, it's just to take a position or to indicate a field of scholarship. But in the end, I think that these animals are a human product in great part, and this is happening in so many scales. You have this more intimate scale where you see the behavior of wild boars being changed by humans who feed them or who pet them. But then you have an infrastructural scale where you see human settlements, trash containers, water reservoirs, and all that comes with cities also altering wild boars' behavior. And then you have like more general climate scale changes that show that with the increase of winter temperatures, also wild boar populations increase. There are some studies made in Europe. So you have, in the end, so many anthropogenic scales going from climate change to intimate circumstances of feeding and petting that are, reshaping the species, that I really don't see the more than human here. And maybe this is a sad point, but I think we are trapped in a sort of human cycle that holds together wild boars and humans.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. Have you seen any studies of domesticated pigs or a related porcine species and wild boars? And do they, how is intentionality of personhood read in those, or, just about the interaction? Have you seen?
Yeah, I have of course come across many studies on wild boars and domestic pigs. And in this group that I was mentioning before, we actually invite scholars working with all kinds of varieties of pigs. And what I remember, but I have not studied this other research. It's just more anecdotal knowledge that I have. But of course, I know that that pigs, other varieties of pigs, are also very intelligent, even in captivity. For instance, I know that pigs can, wash apples. I know that pigs can even play video games if you've appropriate joystick. So they of course have cognitive capabilities that are amazing. They are probably among the most, like the fifth most intelligent species known. But yes, and all this research relates indirectly to my data, but I of course focus more on free wild boars that show their intelligence in a different way.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Anu.
It's an interesting point that you just made, and I suppose a controversial one at that as well, where you say everything, the world is a human world, and that there are no spaces, there are no entities that are not produced or shaped to a varying degree by humans in this age that we call the Anthropocene, in response to the idea of the more than human or the other than human. This made me kind of wonder, how does one then deal with conservationists, for example, who believe that wild boars should remain in what they call their natural habitats? Is there such a thing as a natural habitat left anymore in the Anthropocene? Is there such a pristine, untouched natural space that the wild boars should go back to? Or how does one negotiate the distance between what you say today and what multiple conservationists have been positing for a really long time, this idea of the natural habitats of so-called wild animals?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my point before, I need to nuance a little bit, because I don't think there are no living beings that are not produced by humans. Of course, I think humans are very, very small beings in the end. It's and the world might end. I mean, the humans might end, and the world will continue. This everyone knows. We are not necessary, and many other species can, of course, live without us. But it is. I was thinking about this more in order to frame the situation I'm doing my ethnography, where you really cannot say these particular wild boars living there are not exactly more than human. They are not human, but they are not, they are still completely involved in human environments and humanized environments, and they are completely determined by humans. You were asking about, sorry, the conservation and nature idea. Because yes, if we go through that logic that there is no not human nature, then what's the sense of saying, okay, this animal should stay in that place, because that place is after all human as well. But still, I think there are some spaces that are more protected from for instance, urban dynamics. Here the problem is in particular because we have a natural park. It's very small. You have to imagine a very humble with not very high hills, a couple of forests, but they still called it natural park, which is being invaded by the city from Barcelona and from cities from behind, from other cities. And of course, the fact of calling it natural park, even if we know it's not natural, actually it's completely exploited by humans, by tourism, by mountain bikers, by hunters, by many different of human activities. But still, and this goes back to the former question about the concepts. Even calling it natural still invites some sort of protection of the space. And in this case, I think that indeed wild boars can benefit from still keeping these categories valuable, even if we can deconstruct them academically and even ecologically. If we can show, okay, nature doesn't exist anymore, is still valid as a category. for, you know, kind of organizing ecology in a way that is, you know, reasonable for many species beyond humans. What I see in the problem with nature, however, and this is again, I think, a philosophical question, is when nature becomes a limiting narrative to understand species. And this is the problem I have with other scientists. With conservationists, I have no problem in keeping the natural park alive, in establishing measures to protect it. For instance, you know, limiting the access of public, perhaps, and these kinds of things, you know, establishing some sort of rules. But this narrative sometimes is taken in order to claim, you know, that wild boars who live in the urban environment are deviations of nature, you know, aberrations. It's a very, you know, negative language that I think it does not take into account that actually nature is also something that is human, produced by humans, and it is altered by humans. And since Darwin, you know, all these changes have accelerated in a way that you cannot really speak about nature as you know, being something and everything that goes, you know, besides it to be a deviation. For instance, one of the observations, to make it this kind of philosophical question more specific, one of the things I've observed is that wild boars cause more problems and way more problems when they are in the countryside than in the city. You know, in the city they are more, you know, visible, of course, because they are not usual, but they still, for instance, if you take just one thing that is traffic accidents, and this is probably the major issue after damaging crops, agricultural fields, and so on. Yeah, but this is countryside. But if you take traffic accidents that happen both in the city context and in the rural areas, they are much worse in rural areas. Why? Because people drive faster. You know, these streets have not this limit of speed, and when accidents happen in urban areas where, you know, the speed is limited to 30 kilometers an hour or 50 in some cases, this limitation makes that actually wild boars cause less dramatic traffic accidents. So in the end, what I want to say is you cannot just discard the possibility of having a group, you know, a specific populations of wild boars in peri-urban areas by claiming this is not natural. Okay, this is where I think that the narrative of nature becomes limiting, because you could say it all the way around. Actually, you could say actually these ones are better protected than the other ones that are in rural areas where hunting happens more often, where traffic accidents are, you know, harder, and so on. You could make the opposite reasoning. Yeah, but in the mindset of natural scientists, it's sus scrofa, a wild species, since Linnaeus classified them, and this cannot be changed. But in the practice of people who live with them, they are something different. They are something that is probably changing. So there is even some evolutionary trends here, you know, and it's an evolution. It is not happening by natural selection and so on, but by cultural determinations, you know, by cultural aspects that have to do with society and people and affects and these kinds of things.
Eva, do you want to say something or ask a question?
Yeah, so I wanted to comment and ask, but rather comment. I'm sorry that I had to switch off my camera, but my internet is unstable, unfortunately. I really like your idea of reversibility because I see it both. Now I just did small research in Warsaw. I'm based in Warsaw. About wild boars, but I'm mainly interested in the relations of plants and people. And for me, it's very, very important to, as for you, as you explained, talking about this reversibility concept, to be close to my interlocutors. to really use the emic understanding of plants or animals. That because the new ontologies are we as anthropologists tend to use right now. They are great concepts. I really like it in the sense of intellectually. But when I meet my interlocutors, they do not share them or share them from time to time. This reversibility is really, really, really crucial, because there are moments where plants are saying, moments or situations, contexts in which plants are saint for them, or they can talk with plants and have real connection. And there is many moments then when plants are objectified by them. And being close to this objectification and subjectification, I also like talking about individual. This is really important, and I also see it with plants. Although individuality with plants is much more difficult also in natural terms, because the individual is, for us humans or mammals, in plants it's very different, because you can. One tree can have many trunks, and it's still genetically one tree, but for people it might be a whole forest, many trees. So this looking at the individuality of plant is you can they have this connection with the environment, and people very often, when they collect plants only from a particular place, because they know those particular plants and their relation to the place and the relation people have to the place. So they are not looking at the whole species. They are looking at small populations or even individual plants. And very often, I'm both anthropologist and biologist, botanist, and very often in the natural science discourse, very often you forget about this individual level and the individual features particular animal or even plant has. That's just my comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. If I might jump on the comment, because I'm very curious about how could one actually apply this idea of reversibility or even the infraspecies to the plant realm. So it would be amazing to. I'm not a plant person in the sense I have nothing against plants, but not that I have a hobby, in knowing many species and so on. But it's precisely what you mentioned, that I think that people who actually are, familiar with plants, they don't perceive what is it, but who is it, right? And I would really love to know how is it possible to go to this individual level of saying what kind of particular individual I'm seeing or I'm relating to, instead of what species more generally I'm confronted to. I wanted to also maybe contribute an information which is not in the article, but it might be important, that actually, and this opens also the conversation towards other species, and is that actually the idea of reversibility came to my mind before I used it for this wild boars paper. In my previous fieldwork, I did my research in Amazonia, and one of the apart from humans, which were the main mammals I was following all the day, I was following also pink dolphins. In Amazonia, you have this, sweet river water, like river dolphins. And I was observing that fishermen also relate to these animals in a way that it is not stable, in the sense that some dolphins were considered to be tame, and some dolphins were considered to be wild, and sometimes the same dolphin was considered to be tame with some people and wild with other people. And these were also like wild, intelligent, and sociable mammals, very similar to wild boars, even if morphologically they are very different. But in their capabilities for socializing, they are very similar, and they have all this variability also of behavior and their affective capacities. So in fact, I started to think about this idea of reversibility way before the wild boars research. The thing is that I still didn't have like the concept in a way that I could use it. So I wrote another paper where I described this variability of affects from wild to tame in the context of fishermen and pink dolphins relations. But yes, of course, I think this idea is, I mean, I thought about this idea, and as well as about the idea of infraspecies, in order to think about many other animals, not only about wild boars, but many other animals, and as you were saying, probably also about plants.
That's really interesting about the river dolphins. I just wanted to follow up on two previous questions because we're going to soon run out of time. One of the questions is about subjectivity, and I'm thinking about that, the picture of the beautiful statue in the essay of the woman holding the baby boar in her hand. And I wanted to ask you if you think symbolic representations of animals in general, if they are gesturing towards animal subjectivity in some ways, and if that can be a kind of infraspecies reading of animals or of individual animals. My second question pertains to the question of whether the wild boar has a capacity to deceive. And, you discuss conservationists and hunters. So there is violence towards the wild boar, the violence that the wild boar can inflict. That's like, it's an undercurrent in the paper. And I wanted to know whether violence could be seen as some kind of, like a definitive act of capacity to deceive, or a definitive act of intentionality. And I wanted to know if we are making a mistake, or if it would be dangerous to attribute intentionality that way, because, in some ways it's better for wild animals for us to say that they're not doing this because they want to hurt us. They're doing this because of climate change, or because of people forcing them out of their habitats or something like that. So then I guess the third question would be if intentionality would be something dangerous to attribute to what is not human.
Wow, yeah, that's a very interesting and difficult question. Let me start with the first one, which is easier, about the symbolic aspects. You mentioned this picture that I put on the paper, which shows a giant sculpture holding a baby wild boar. And this is something that is very particular from Barcelona, I would say, because, and it is another infraspecies level. You can think about this infraspecies as a sort of individual level. Everyone has her own relations with other living beings in his own way. But there is also a cultural dimension, which is smaller than the species dimension, but still it is, a collective in a sense. And I think that in Barcelona, what we observe is a cultural, arena where these things are very keen to happen. There is a lot of celebration of wild boar. It's a sort of, reivindication of certain wildness of the city. you see many, festivals where, the main icon is the wild boars. You have sports associations where they are called like the wild boar or something like that. And there is, in a sense, there is a celebration. And this is very, recalcitrant because, local authorities, they don't want this. They want actually people, mentalize that, okay, wild boars don't belong here, but many people are welcoming them. Yeah. And this is not happening in other cities. For instance, in Spain, of course, you find people, but not to the extent. In Barcelona, I would say that even the majority of people living in the peripheral neighborhoods, they are happy with it. And this is the major problem that conservationists have. The problem is not the wild boars. The problem is just the people that want the wild boars in. So, and this is something that indeed it is expressed through many symbolic and iconic expressions of wild boars that show that in Barcelona there is this culture also of feeding not only wild boars, but we also feed stray cats, seagulls, pigeons, of course, dogs, everything. We feed the children on the street. We are constantly feeding each other. This happening across species, and I think wild boars are also a consequence of this cultural tradition. Probably, I know it's not exclusive from Barcelona, but I see a connection in what happens, like from a cultural, local culture point of view. And your other comment on deception, on violence and intentionality. Okay, I suddenly it came to my mind one instance where I could see something as deception or something similar, but it's just an anecdote. I cannot claim this is, an ethnographic, case. But once I was with hunters, and they were like going after some wild boars, and there is a road which is at the same time the border between the natural park and the city. And the hunters, they can shoot only in the natural park. Yeah, okay, but this is always, they are separated by a road. And at some point, the wild boars just noticed that hunters were after them, and they crossed the road, and they just stood there, and a hunter told me, and I will use his words, this son of a bitch knows that we cannot shoot there. And they were in a physical situation where they could be shot, but actually it's as if they knew on the other side of the road they could not, be killed. So in that moment, it's not exactly deception, but it shows some knowledge. But as I was saying, this is only an anecdote. I observed this once, and I don't know even if that was the case or that was just a casualty. And what you say about intentionality, yeah, it's actually an ethical problem, right? Because indeed, I think that wild boars are there unintentionally in some sense, because of these external pressures by humans. But I also see them, in a sense, enjoying the city. You see many behaviors that are not just survival. They are not just eating. They are, for instance, there are some parks where you have this sand which is smooth, like sand from the beach, and they actually select these places to just lay down and relax. So I see many instances where you see the animal, not just surviving and under this climate pressure and so on, but actually enjoying the city. And yes, indeed, this has the other side of this observation, is that, okay, then you can kind of blame them for being there and for, falling the city and so on. But I still don't know what we should do. I think we should recognize the subjectivity and the ability to make some decisions, but of course always taking care of not abusing this idea and blaming them for things that are of which they are not guilty. And of course, in the end, we are sort of invading a space which was a natural park, or it is still a natural park, but residential pressure, it's putting more and more people on these areas, and we cannot say actually we say people say they are invading these areas, but actually it's all the way around. If you see this urban development, historically, what happens is all the contrary. They are just where they have always been, right? So we cannot blame them or attribute any intentionality. They have always been there, and they probably will be there always. Yeah.
And on that note, we come to the end of the session. Thanks so much, Aníbal, for spending this 1 hour with us. It was a great talk. It was great to see all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and yeah, looking forward to watch more of your conversations. They are nice. Thanks for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.